Behind me is Independence Hall, which is where the revolutionary government, the Second Continental Congress, met during much of the War for American Independence. This is where the Declaration of Independence was debated and passed. Um, and then years later on, this is where the Constitution uh, was the Constitutional Convention was held, and the Constitution emerged from that. Now, Independence Hall is the present day photo of it in present day Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was the capital of what would become the United States during the Revolutionary War. But there were times when the Continental Congress, the government had to go elsewhere, to Baltimore, to Harrisburg, so forth, because of threats from the British Army. Indeed, the British at one point, captured Philadelphia. But it's really emblematic of what we'll be dealing with in this lecture presentation on the American Revolution. Now, I'll tell you right now, in a way, it's a bit of a misnomer to say that the American Revolution began in 1775, which is the point at which we're going to begin this lecture. The Really, the origins of the American Revolution, of course, go back to 1765, to the Stamp Act, the first major crisis between the revolutionary-minded colonists and the British government. And from then on, it was, things were in crisis mode until you finally get the beginnings of the military conflict in April 1775. John Adams, who was a member of the Second Continental Congress and, of course, to be the second president of the United States, he once said that the revolution was complete in the minds of the American citizens, by the time that the fighting actually began. So that's one of his comments. But another comment, and this is a more important one, really kind of belies the first. Adams also said that, in his opinion, during the War for American Independence, 1/3 of the colonists were revolutionary, were invested in the revolutionary cause. 1/3 were loyalists, which is to say they remained loyal to the British monarch, George III, back in Great Britain. And then 1/3 were sort of neutral or passive. They kind of didn't care who won, and they just want to kind of stay out from, just stay away from it. They regarded the war as kind of a hurricane coming back and forth, and not something, that they cared very much about. It was just something that they wished would go away. Uh, Adams was probably wrong about this. The number of loyalists, those loyal to the king, was probably considerably smaller than 1/3, maybe 20%. Okay. The number of revolutionaries was about right. Let's call it 35%, 40%, something like that. But that still leaves really a majority of colonists who were neutral or passive, who just didn't care enough to involve themselves in the revolution any more than they absolutely had to. And when you think about many moments of historical crisis, political crisis in particular, you will find that most people in these kinds of moments just want to focus on, their families, their regular lives, their work. Just they just want things to remain normal, and so they don't get involved. And and that's just kind of the way that human nature, I think, operates. When we look back at the past, we always think, well, look back at the American Revolution. Well, I would have been a firm revolutionary, and I would have been, fighting on behalf of American liberty, or supporting the revolutionary cause in other ways, and giving supplies to the Continental Army and this kind of a thing. Probably you wouldn't. If you're not actively involved politically in this particular moment, and I'm giving this lecture in autumn of 2025, and this is a period in which many politically minded Americans regard this as a moment of crisis, and that is true whether you are conservative or whether you are liberal. And even people in the middle of things, regard the political culture. There's sort of a hyper partisanship and a really strong sense of division. And even in this moment, you know, a great many Americans really just are standing off to one side. They might be watching Fox News or MSNBC, or seeing things on Facebook and doing status updates and so forth, but nothing more active than that. They're on the sidelines. You might ask yourself, is that you? And if it is you, is that the kind of person that you really want to be? Or do you really, when you really think about it, do you think that you should be in the arena, active in terms of thinking about your political beliefs, and then doing something active in support of those beliefs? It's something to think about. It is something that the revolutionary generation thought about, and as I say, a great many of them just kind of wanted to stay out of the way from it. I'm going to share the screen with you. As always, I find this a cumbersome process. I will never get to like it. Okay. All right. Here are the terms. And by the way, the key terms are what you're going to be focusing on as you think about the preliminary midterm examinations coming up, and the midterm examination, and ultimately the final exam. And really the way to approach this material is to think in terms of the storyline, the narrative, and the important events and personalities and so forth. If your major field or whatever is in the STEM disciplines, a lot of what you're doing is kind of memorizing definitions of things or memorizing formulas, and that's what you're focused in on. And I think when you look at history, you're thinking in those same kind of things. What do I need to know about? What person do I need to know about? What event do I need to know about? And you see it in sort of isolation from the whole. That's not really a way to look at it. What you want to look at it is as a story, as a narrative. And as you read the American Yawp, and as you listen to these lecture presentations and so forth, focus on the narrative, how things unfold, how one event influences, the next event, how things sort of play out chronologically. Who are the main players? What are their motivations? What are they trying to accomplish, and so on. If you do that, you're going to fare better when it comes time to do the examination, and you'll be a lot less kind of confused as you go along. Okay, here are the terms. We'll move on to the next. The opening battles of the Revolution occurred in April 1775, and this happened when a British force left Boston and went into the interior to confiscate arms and ammunition that were under the control of the Massachusetts militia. And the Massachusetts militia fought back. There was a small skirmish at Lexington. A few Minutemen, the militia, were killed there. There was a larger engagement at Concord. And then when the British turned back around and headed back to Boston, the militia sort of chased after them and ambushed them from a number of positions. And the losses that the British sustained on the march back to Boston meant that these battles of Lexington and Concord ended up being a significant British defeat. And so, this kind of surprised the British and emboldened the militia. And then there was a war that was underway, mostly in Massachusetts at first, and eventually, of course, it would spread into other colonies/states. Now, from the American perspective, who's presiding over this war effort? Well, it is the Second Continental Congress. There had been a First Continental Congress that dealt with, pre-war concerns. Here's the crisis. Here's what the British government is doing. What are we going to do about it? The Second Continental Congress convened, a few weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So it was a wartime Congress, and it became the de facto national government. Now, as a national government, is concerned, it was really not much of one. It had no executive, nothing like president or prime minister or anything like that. It was all government by committee. During the course of the American Revolution, John Adams sat on no fewer than 80 different committees. And even the direction of the war effort was done by committee, which is hardly the most efficient way to do that. The Continental Congress had no power to tax, and the money that it issued to pay for to pay the salaries, to pay for the soldiers, to pay for the supplies for the army and so forth were really promissory notes. It's like, hey, here's a dollar, but it's a piece of paper. But after the war is over, we'll pay you in like real money. You know, and of course this all depended on from the the person who got these continental these dollars, their estimate of who was going to win the war. And for a long time, your estimate was, well, the Americans probably aren't going to win the war, and therefore this money, this is a piece of paper, and it is pretty much worthless. So that was a problem that the Continental Congress had for a long time, and that the American war effort had for a long time until salvation came in a form that I'll get to down the line. Eventually, the Congress created a very loose national government through ratification of what were called the Articles of Confederation. And we'll do more with the Articles of Confederation in a future lecture. But basically, in November 1777, the Continental Congress finally got around to sort of creating an actual government. You know, and the delegates who drafted the framework for this shared one very strong conviction, and that conviction was that power, especially power removed so far from the people, was inherently dangerous. And the only way to preserve liberty was to place as many constraints as possible on this national government. And so most of the political power remained with the states. And this, after the war was over, the Articles of Confederation arrangement quickly became really problematic and gave way to the U.S. Constitution, creating that. But the Articles of Confederation arrangement was the way that the government by which the war was fought. Now, a big thing that the Continental Congress did very early on was that it authorized the creation of a continental army. And this happened at a time when the actual fighting was confined to the area right around Boston. And the soldiers who were fighting the British were Massachusetts militia, which is a part-time soldier, citizen soldiers, and then a smattering of militia from other New England colonies. And yet the Congress decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to create an army that represents all of the colonies, even though the fighting is confined to Boston right now, and it's far from a national kind of a thing. They placed George Washington in charge of this Continental Army, not so much because George Washington was considered to be any sort of military genius or whatever, but he was a prominent man from Virginia. He had had some experience during the French and Indian War as a militia officer. He was an imposing figure, and the kind of person that you could trust, but definitely not a military genius. What was his main qualification for the top job? He was from Virginia, the most populous of the 13 colonies. And the idea was, we put a Virginian in charge of this Continental Army, it will underscore that this is an effort being made by all 13 colonies. Now, why have a continental army? Why not just rely on the various colonial militia forces? Well, the first, and I've already kind of mentioned this, it was to present a united front on the part of all the colonies. And so this is again is why George Washington was placed in charge because, he symbolized this united front. Secondly, this Continental Army would be composed, unlike militia, who basically, these militiamen would come from their regular jobs, farms, merchantmen, whatever, and then take the field for short periods of time and then go back home. The Continental Army, these soldiers would be recruited for longer periods of time, long enough that they could be trained to a standard where they were capable of fighting the British Army toe to toe. And the British Army at this time was considered one of the best in the world. The third factor is that it enhanced the revolutionaries' claim to legitimacy. You know, if you're fighting a war and it's just a bunch of militia here and there and everywhere and so forth, it looks like an insurgency. It looks like you know freedom fighters, or it looks very very vague. And what the Continental Congress wanted to underscore was, hey, what we're doing is legitimate. Our cause is legitimate. Our structure, is legitimate. And so, the Continental Army was an important factor in this. But, and this is an important but, there was a suspicion, a long-standing suspicion, both in England and in the colonies, of a standing army. And the Continental Army was considered kind of a standing, army of a kind. Now, a standing army is a professional army, and this professional army, in England, to just use one example, in the 17th century, the English army, the British army, was controlled by the monarch, King Charles I, and what the British or the English in Parliament discovered was that King Charles I was using his army as an instrument for tyranny. And this fear of a standing army, an army completely under the control of the monarch, remained in the English military tradition. And then the colonists, of course, inherited this suspicion of a standing army. And of course, they had their own problems with the British army, occupying, the colonies during the period of these revolutionary, crises that preceded the actual fighting. And now, of course, you had a professional army that had attempted to take the militias, supplies, and so forth, in the struggles of Lexington and Concord. And so, as a result, throughout the war, the Continental Congress actually was suspicious of the senior generals, even George Washington. And it also, from a supply standpoint, kept the Continental Army on a short leash, not to, so that it just wouldn't become that powerful. And George Washington was very, very intent upon demonstrating that he viewed himself as under the control of the Continental Army or a Continental Congress. And so if he received a letter or some kind of communication and it looked as if something that the Continental Congress should have a look at, he wouldn't open it. He would send it to the Continental Congress. He was very good about keeping in good communication with the Continental Congress, and he kept making this case over and over again. The Continental Army is not a standing army. These are citizens who believe in the revolutionary cause. These are citizens who care enough about it to enlist for longer terms than the militia, but they are still citizen soldiers. They are not a standing army in any way, shape, or form, and concerns about this are misplaced. Well, this really is something that a lot of Americans still didn't buy into, and indeed would remain suspicious of long after the United States gained its independence and on through the 19th century. I need to stop for a moment and talk about the different kinds of soldiers. There's the Continental Army, which we just discussed, relatively long-term volunteer soldiers who trained to fight British regular and mercenary troops toe to toe. And by mercenary troops, I'm talking about soldiers who were hired mainly from German states like Hesse to, they fought on the British side and they fought for money. They were very good. They were very good soldiers, and as long as the British monarch paid them, or paid the prince who controlled them, then they were happy to fight. But they didn't care about the conflict otherwise. Another type that's important are the militia, and these were under state control, and they were short-term volunteers, and they supplemented the Continental Army. And by supplementing the Continental Army, I mean to say that if the Continental Army was operating in a certain area and they needed reinforcements, then the militia would be called out and it would come to support the Continental Army in battles and so forth and operations. But the militia had an idea of, okay, here's the situation in which we're going to support the Continental Army, and here's the situation in which we're not going to because we didn't buy into this thing. There was a time when the Continental Army wanted to besiege a British garrison at Newport, Rhode Island, and the militia came out in an attempt to sort of attack Newport, Rhode Island, and capture the British, and quickly. And when this didn't pan out, and the Continental Army general said, "Well, I'd like you guys to stick around and help us besiege, Newport and the British there." And so the militia's like, "We didn't sign up for this. We're going to go back to our homes and our plows and so forth." So the militia was a force that you could count on militarily, but only up to a certain point. And they weren't trained to the same standard as the Continental Army soldiers. And so in a battle, anything could happen. They could stand tough or they could break and run. You just didn't know what was going to, how things were going to play out with the militia. But, and this is a huge but, and we'll deal with it more later down the line with this lecture. The militia was really good at maintaining control over the population. I have a Revolutionary War ancestor, a guy named Richard Harvin, and if I wanted to, I could sort of go back and be a son of the American Revolution, by dint of my relationship to this Richard Harvin guy. Well, he wasn't in the Continental Army. He wasn't even in the militia, kind of. He lived in South Carolina, and when the war broke out, there were a lot of loyalists, people so loyal to the British crown, and they lived in the back country, sort of the hilly country in the mountains and so forth. In the very western part of South Carolina. He got together with a bunch of other guys and officers, and they went into the upcountry to intimidate these loyalists. They were basically a bunch of thugs, and that was their job. So, he never fought in a battle. His job was basically to intimidate these loyalists so they wouldn't create any problems. Now, these loyalists didn't take this kind of thing, lying down, and you got a loyalist militia, which is to say these are American, you know, colonists, and they played an identical role to the revolutionary militia, except they did it on the British side. And when the British Army was around, the Loyalist militia was also around. And so what you have are the revolutionary militia and the Loyalist militia, vying with one another for control over the population, to intimidate them, to sort of, cause them to fall into line on the revolutionary side or the British side. And this is where the militia is really the most important, is in this role of population control.